got something to offer.
Welcome to Something to Offer, the show that spotlights people living their dreams and making a difference. And now the host of our show, Anne Marie Offer.
Something that's new, something to offer, and that something is you. You've got a vision, you persevere, you keep on trying, you're a pioneer. 'Cause you've got something to offer, something that's new, something to offer, and that something is you.
I was delighted to be able to interview the UN Ambassador to Human Rights and our former 1984 Vice President candidate, Geraldine Ferraro, and I'm very excited for you to hear just what she has to offer. Jerry, you've had an incredible career and journey. You've been a mother, a wife, teacher. What prompted you to take all this and go into the political arena? Where did this start from?
Well, the nice thing is that I haven't done all of those things all at the same time. Each one of the jobs that I've had has been just part of the progression. In fact, it's very funny. I had never planned for the next job while I'm doing a job. But when I get to the end of the job that I'm doing, I say, well, maybe I'd like to do something a little bit different. In fact, my kids still say to me, what are you going to be when you grow up? But it was one thing at a time. I was a teacher when I graduated from college because my mother, who was a widow and who found herself at the age of 39 with 2 kids to support and no formal education, really felt it was important for me to be educated and to have a job where if I were left in a position where I had to support children, I could be home at 3 o'clock when they were home at 3 o'clock and would make a decent salary to make sure that they were adequately cared for. But I always wanted to be a lawyer, so I went to law school at night, which is the only time I could afford it. Then I got married as soon as I graduated from law school and started having children right away. And for that period of time, for 13 years, I stayed home and took care of my children. And then it was time to go back to work, and I wanted to practice law, and so I took advantage of the fact that my cousin had just been elected district attorney of Queens County, and I applied for a job. I worked on his campaign just like everybody else, and I got the job. And I stayed on even after he left to become a Supreme Court judge. I worked for his successor, and when working for his successor, I was able to move into the position of bureau chief, which is a supervising trial attorney. And then doing that, just decided that the crimes that I was dealing with, the women who were victims of sexual abuse, children who were referred to the criminal court from the family court because of child abuse, women who were battered spouses. Those were situations where I felt that the victims were just being treated very unfairly by society, but also I recognized that we had to do something about the people who were committing the crimes besides putting them in jail. We had to look back and say, what can we as a society do to prevent people from moving into a life of crime? And so I decided the only way I could do that was by being a legislator, and that's when I ran for office, ran for Congress. So all the jobs that I've had have just been a progression.
Like a little stairway up.
Into something new, something challenging, a place where I think I can make a difference.
You went to the convention in '84. You were going as the first chair of the platform committee, and then when you got there, or probably a little bit before, I don't want to make it sound like it was just a total surprise, but you weren't sure when you got there whether you were going to be the nominee for 100% sure, and I wondered what it was like to shift gears so fast. I mean, it must have been like a whirlwind. I mean, I know from the book myself that it was, but how does one go from one thing to another without a lot of warning? I mean, were you one of those people, you didn't say, I want to be a vice president when you were a little girl or something?
Oh, no. When I was a little girl, the thought of anybody being any girl being a president or vice president. I mean, it was just out of the question. That wasn't what we did. And in fact, it wasn't only when I was a little girl. It was until 1984. I mean, people just didn't think of women in those terms. They kind of felt it would happen someday. But I had actually sought the position of chair of the platform committee, not because I saw myself as a candidate for vice president, but because I really wanted to run for the Senate in 1986, and felt that if I got to be chair of the platform committee, not only would I be able to help shape a platform which I felt our candidate could run and win on, I wanted to be a platform that addressed the principles of the Democratic Party and that dealt with some of the problems that we were having as a nation with the policies of Ronald Reagan and George Bush. So on the substance, I really wanted to have input into this whole thing. As a member of Congress, I knew how important it was to have a platform that other members of Congress wouldn't run away from, that senators wouldn't run away from, that they would be there to support whoever our candidate was. But as a politician and as someone who saw an opportunity for my own career, I saw this as an opportunity for me also to get a little bit of national attention, so that when I was going to run for the Senate in 1986, and I was going to start immediately after the convention to raise money, I would be able to raise money throughout the country because people would know who Gerry Ferraro was, having been around on hearings on the platform for 6 months before, and also addressing the National Convention as chair of the platform committee. So,
which was a first also for women.
It was the first time a woman was in that position. But what happened was I went out to the convention a week early because I had speeches to give in furtherance of my role as platform chair. And it was when I was out there that I got a visit from John Riley, who had been sent by the Mondale campaign to do the last minute checking and everything else, and then found out the next day that I was the person chosen. And so then it became a whirlwind type of an event. But basically, I was prepared in that on the issues I had studied the issues, I had lived the issues for 6 years as a member of Congress. I knew exactly what I felt was right for the country, again, both as platform chair and as a member of Congress. I certainly knew Fritz Mondale well. His background as Attorney General and Senator were not unknown to me, but certainly his experience in the White House as the Vice President was known to me, and I had worked with Fritz, as I'd worked with all the other candidates on the platform. So it wasn't a total shock, and it wasn't a total shifting of gears, though I must say being a candidate for Vice President was unlike anything that I had ever experienced or will ever experience again.
I wanted to ask in terms of that, when you accepted the nomination, when you knew you were going to be nominated, did you ever get overwhelmed by the sense of the responsibility that you had when you agreed to do that? And also, were you at all prepared for the intense scrutiny and ruthlessness of what I feel the press and like living under a microscope? Because I feel anybody in that kind of position is really, so looked at. It's like, is your hem right? I mean, they just pick to every nth degree.
I was ready to accept responsibility. I mean, it's rather mind-boggling when all of a sudden it hits you that I'm putting myself in a position to run for an office where, if something were to happen to Fritz Mondale and he were the president, I would take over. I mean, it's the most powerful and important job in the world. And it is a very humbling experience, but you don't run for that office unless you think you can do it. And of course, I had seen people like Ronald Reagan go in and do the job, so I figured if he can do it, surely I could do it. But it was a very humbling experience. But by the same token, you say, was I prepared for the scrutiny? No, I expected media attention, but I didn't expect what happened in the course of that campaign, which I'm now finding out a little bit more. I had somebody contact me. The White House really ran a campaign to destroy me, and when I was not a sufficient target, they went after my mother. My father had been dead 40-some-odd years.
Oh yeah, and I was reading stuff about.
They went after my husband. I mean, it was incredible. And when I say they went after, they used the FBI. I mean, things that as an American you turn around and say, hey, that's not right in this country. but it was done. And, you know, that's the piece that you're just never prepared for. I also didn't really know how to deal with the press. I mean, I was who I was. I was a third-term member of Congress. I was a person from Queens. 6 years before, I was Geraldine when I won the congressional spot. I had not been used to the media, and they really weren't. They weren't ready for me either. I mean, they didn't quite know how to deal with a woman candidate. The women reporters, and I ended up with a lot of these women are good friends of mine now. Mm-hmm. They kind of fell all over themselves. They didn't want to look too soft. And a lot of them had been crying at the convention when I got the nomination. They didn't want to look too soft, so they bent over backwards to be very tough. And the men, interestingly enough, a lot of them kind of, like Ted Koppel and a few others, were a little bit condescending in how they questioned me certainly on military issues, defense issues, foreign policy issues.
Assuming you wouldn't know these things, yeah.
It was like a test. I mean, today you're having your oral exam and this stuff. Stuff that they've asked me that they would never ask a man, and certainly never asked Ronald Reagan, who had less experiences than I in dealing with these issues when he ran for president.
I'm sure you were the most scrutinized person ever to run for an office.
I'll tell you a funny story. In 1988, when Dan Quayle was running for vice president, my husband and I were watching him in an interview, and he started to whine, and he said, you know, I have been subjected to more interviews and more media attention. I have been subjected to more attention and more scrutiny than any other person who's ever run for vice president. And I turned around and I said to my husband, you know, John, he's young, but he can't be that young. He has to remember what happened in 1984. And it was a tough time. If you take a look at the stuff that Dan Quayle went through, people were entitled to know whether or not he did well in school. They certainly checked that all out on me. They checked to find out. The American Lawyer did a very, very intense look at my background, both as a law student and as a lawyer. That's legitimate. That is perfectly legitimate. It goes to whether or not you can do the job. Right. Whether or not he served in the military. I mean, that's important. If indeed you turn around and you are, you know, really supportive of the military, supportive, you know, if you're a hawk on this stuff. I mean, do you live your life one day and act another in office? Those are legitimate. Just like, I mean, I'm very pro-choice. You know, to look back on my background, you know, you have to say that, you know, I care about kids, I care about people. I mean, people are entitled to know, have I ever been at one point anything but what I'm putting myself out to be? Right. Have I ever voted a different way? Could I go out and say I'm pro-choice and then have voted in an anti-choice way when I was in Congress? Could I say I support education for little kids and then vote against Head Start? I mean, those are very legitimate things to look into. And so the way scrutiny and attention is garnered on a candidate is important and is relevant, except when it gets personal. And when it gets personal, it goes after your family. And ruthless, I think, somewhat ruthless. You're so determined, funny, compassionate, and down to earth. Where do these qualities come from, and how were you able to sustain them throughout your career? You know, everybody's coming at you. You know, when I ended the campaign in 1984, in that period of time, that 4 months, I was really on a high. I mean, you're constantly surrounded by Secret Service. You go to crowds and all people are screaming for you. I mean, it was the most mind-boggling thing. You know, everybody wants you. They want your attention. And then all of a sudden it ends. And I immediately got down to earth. I immediately said I did not want the Secret Service even for a day after it was all over. Which they kind of give you a weaning period because, and Jesse Jackson Aniston had for quite a bit of time after he was running in the primaries. But I wanted to get back to my own life. And someone said to me, how do you go from all that attention to go, you know, to your normal life? Let's go back to my supermarket, do my thing. And I said, part of it is that when you have kids and you live in the real world, I mean, I would go home and candidate or no candidate, my kids would say to me, oh, God, no, when you're out, I'm going to be at such and such. I'm running out of clean clothes. And candidate, I'd be making sure they'd get their clothes wherever they were. And come home, they say, Mom, the dog just threw up down the basement. And, you know, so who goes down and deals with this stuff? You very quickly, kids make you come down to earth very quickly. And so, though during the campaign I was up on this level and kind of not in the real world, when I came home, my home is my home. And my
mother seems to be really an amazing person, and I love the one quote. Whenever, I think she said it to you a long time ago.
Woman it's really sad. At one point right before she died, she was in her 80s, mid-80s when she died. She said to me, you know, as a nation, this is the best time of my life. She had no worries about money. She had no worries about anything. I mean, her health gave way at the end, but she was happy. That's really very sad. That, you know, she really did have a tough life, and yet never complained. Never ever complained. Very strong. Always, if something went wrong, would say, "All right, now I've got 2 kids. I've got to worry about tomorrow." And so she would always look
ahead.
I mean, to avoid the pitfall that made, if it was something that she did or was able to control, she would avoid it the next time. And if it was nothing that she could control, she would get on. And truly, if I do nothing else than pass those lessons on to my children, and I think I have, you know, because they've run into things too, when you turn around and say, okay, it's over, let's see how we can make this situation better, and if we can't, let's move on and see what tomorrow holds. That's my mother.
When you committed yourself, you know, to serving all your various jobs in the government, and currently now too with the being an ambassador of human rights for the UN, did you think you were making a lifelong commitment at any point? I know you said steps along the way, because there's one quote from Changing History that I like from one of the speeches, and you say, once you've been involved in the inner workings of government, in the legislative bodies that set policies, in the debates that involve the future of this country, you don't just walk away.
Well, it's not so much that I ever made a lifelong commitment to a job, but I think we all, in our individual ways, make a commitment to family, to neighbors, to community, to friends, to whatever. Part of that, I really believe, is because of my mother and her commitment to me and my brother, and but part of it is also the way I was raised. I was raised in a very Catholic home. My mother impressed upon me that you have an obligation. She didn't come saying you have an obligation to do that, but she showed by example. You know, the landlady was a African American who had a little kid, and my mother didn't have any money, but my mother was a crochet beater, and that's what she did for a living. And the little girl was receiving her communion, did not have veil and crown. My mother made it for her.
Wow.
I went to visit that woman. It was very funny, about 4 years ago, and the woman pulled out the picture of her daughter. The woman was 91 years old, and her daughter is now a grandmother, and I met the daughter's grandson. It was very funny. I mean, these 4 generations. And the woman just put her arms around me and cried, 91 years old, and said, "This is what your mother did." My mother did that. There was not this sense of, you know, I'm white, you're black, and the woman was our landlady for one thing, but my mother always had a sense that people are people, and that you made a difference for them. She did it in her way. I try to do it in mine. I think if I couldn't make a difference, or even a small difference, I wouldn't do a job.
What is your mission in the UN, and does that vary greatly from the missions that you had or have throughout your life, in terms of when you were a congresswoman or when you were a lawyer defending your clients? Has your mission shifted? It's all seems to be human rights to me.
Yeah.
So,
well, basically, except I never really considered that. I mean, when I was a prosecutor and I was handling cases, I mean, It was not as if I was dealing with the human rights of people who had been violated, but actually, basically, I mean, now that you think about it, it was. I didn't think about it in those terms. I was doing my job. I felt that what I was doing was important for my little corner of society. But I think that with what I'm doing now, the reason I got involved in this issue was that I started seeing pictures of women who were victims of rape in the former Yugoslavia coming into my living room via television in December of 1992. And when I saw those pictures, all I could do was think back to the victims that I had worked with in 1975 and 76 and 70. And I was devastated because for them it was so much worse. I mean, my victims were victims of one incident mostly. We had caught the person who had committed the crime. We were going to punish them for doing it. Here, these women and girls were being raped systematically, gang raped. I mean, it was awful. And they were being used as a weapon of war, and it was a genocidal type of thing. And I mentioned to Madeleine Albright, who's a close friend of mine, I said, I can't stand it. She said, why don't you do something? I mean, would you be interested in going to the Human Rights Commission and see if you can do something on it? And I said, yeah. And that's how I basically got started. I came out of the Human Rights Commission each time, and I come home each time after 6 weeks there and say, what did I really do? And I don't know. I mean, you hope that you've saved maybe some lives. You hope you've made a difference in some instance, but you're never quite sure. It's never quite the same way as it is in the DA's office where you're in jail. You know you've got.
You saw it and it's completed.
You're never quite sure of exactly what you've gotten done, but everything, I think, even focusing attention on people who violate human rights and governments who violate human rights is important.
You have had incredible successes in your career, but I know in the book you indicated that, I mean, you obviously you lost the vice president candidacy, but you were really devastated by not winning the Senate in '92. At least you mentioned that in the book, and I wondered if you, in your life, I have this philosophy, many people do, and that out of adversity comes a lot of good. And did you think that your losses have been gains in some way in terms of your life?
Well, let me go back to in '84. I really didn't feel we lost. I mean,
you won, but I meant
no. Ronald Reagan really won. I mean, he was so popular that you know I've kidded and said even if God were on the ticket, she could not have beaten Ronald Reagan. I mean, it was incredible. He was incredibly popular. We were 20 points behind. And what actually happened was because of the candidacy, I'm not speaking about Jerry Ferraro, I'm talking about the candidacy. Candidacy did open doors for women in this country and did make a difference. And so women won in that election just by the candidacy itself. In 1992, it was quite different. In 1992, I was ahead by 18 points. I was going to go to the Senate. I was all ready to move. I could have beaten, Al D'Amato. I think it would have made a difference. But I had two people whom I had supported in the Democratic primary who attacked me on, this irrelevant stuff that wasn't even true. And all of a sudden I saw Lee just collapse, and I lost by 10,000 votes. The thing that was terrible was that I lost, number one. Number two, we lost the Senate seat again to Al D'Amato, whom I think is a disaster. But the third thing about that was that the two people whom I had supported, I felt my judgment was obviously bad in supporting them for the number of years, but they not only ruined my career, they ruined theirs as well. And one of them was a woman, and we have so few women in office, to have two of us destroyed in one race was silly. That still is a very painful race. It was a very expensive race, both financially and emotionally. And I don't know if I'd ever run again as a result of that. People keep saying to me, run, and I'm still a little bit gun-shy from it. So I look at it and say, well, let me see what I can do to help others. And that's what I'm in the process of doing now.
Has it been difficult to include your personal life in your work, all of your work, and your body of work, and in campaigns? And do you feel that gave you an advantage over other people in the same arena?
I don't see how you can exclude your personal life from any job that you do. We all bring our experiences to whatever the job is that we do. And I brought every one of my experiences with me to Congress. My experiences as a wife, my experience as a mother, my experience as a prosecutor, my experience as someone active in my community, my experience as someone who was a scholarship student from the South Bronx. I mean, those are all our experiences, and as a result, if you look at legislation that I was very active in, it reflects those. But that's not unusual. All of us do that. I mean, every single member of Congress brings their experiences to what they do. I think it's also I bring it to the UN. I bring it to Geneva. I give speeches in Geneva that people listen, and people have never heard it done the way I do it, because I personalize it. I make every one of the people around my delegation, if they're giving a speech, personalize it and talk about something, because I want people not only to listen, but I also want them to hear. And the only way they are going to understand where I'm coming from is if they can associate themselves with something besides the words. And it works, and it works well. We are highly successful in moving on things that we want done in Geneva. And I must say, I was always successful when I needed something done on legislation in the Congress.
You woke up the nation and the world through your career, and we've never really fallen asleep again, but we do doze off occasionally. I'm wondering if you could tell us now what we as citizens of the world need to do to wake up further and take action. Well,
my biggest problem is that we seem to focus on ourselves. And that's been part of the rhetoric of the right wing for the past 15 years. It's been, are you any better off than you were, 4 years ago? That question that was asked in 1980 has really invaded the consciousness of us, of the citizenry of this country. And I have a little bit of trouble with it. I'm not saying that we shouldn't think of ourselves. I think of my kids first. I think of my family first. But I don't think that we should think of ourselves exclusively. And when we do that, we end up with people in office who are focused on personal gain. We end up with government policies that in many instances are mean, not concerned about the poor, not concerned about the elderly, not concerned about anybody else except myself. And I think we end up with government policies on an international level where people turn around and say, why should we get involved? It's not our business. Despite the fact that it's a big world to travel around, it's a very little world when it comes to how we affect each other's lives. And I would hope that the American public would wake up a little bit from the white wing dream that, or the spell that they've been under for the last number of years, and start focusing a little bit on the community, the world community, and that's as large as the family or the neighborhood, or as small as the entire globe.
Great. Well, I thank you so much for your time. I wish we could do more, and you're just an example in the American dream and what one needs to do to make things happen in this world and in our lives. So thank you.
Thank you.